Today, I'm so excited about having a conversation with an insider, the president of the Brownstone Institute, Jeffrey Tucker, about the state of the United States. Please join us for this discussion as we zero in on the question: is the United States still the land of the free and home of the brave?
A clear path forward requires looking back and learning. Good public policy requires human connection. It's a consideration of the facts, applying common sense and innovation. It's urban, it's rural, it's real life. We all have something to contribute. We all have a responsibility to get informed because there's a little piece of Canada in all of us, isn't there? Let's learn on this path together. This is Leaders on the Frontier.
Let's talk about the state of the United States. Is the United States the home of the free and home of the brave? Is it still free?
It is not free. In fact, we had some of the worst lockdowns in the world, and we've not recovered from them yet. On March 13th, 2020, the National Security Council was put in charge of our COVID response. And I do think that was a striking departure from everything that Americans stand for. The Bill of Rights became moot. The courts didn't function. We weren't allowed to go to church. We couldn't. We even had internal travel restrictions. Like nothing that ever like this had ever happened in American history, where suddenly rights and liberties just didn't matter. And the extraordinary thing about that is that while all these controls seem to be gone, the locus of power has not shifted back to a citizen-based government again. The administrative state is still solidly in charge, and they can do that to us again and much worse if they want to. And there's very little efforts underway to fix this problem. So Americans really do have a sense of having lost control of their country and lost control of their destiny. The old patriotic songs we used to sing about home of the brave and the free and all that stuff, it just don't seem to resonate anymore. And there's a lot of hopelessness in this country. It's a broken culture, a broken society with a broken political system.
Wow.
And we're headed straight to recession right now. So it's destined to get worse before it gets better.
Well, that's a stunning summation. I think a lot of Canadians might be, I'm not sure what to say, surprised maybe by your summation. I know that the United States is our closest ally and friend, and in many ways we're very similar. But I think a lot of Canadians, the last 5 years in particular, have really paid close attention to the political scene in the United States and the state of that country, that great country. And so, before we kind of dive more into all those areas that you've mentioned, Jeffrey, I did want to pause a little bit and say, look, the United States, if we look over its history, is really an incredible country. It's made, in many respects, a profound difference in our world. And so,
Mhm.
from your perspective, what has made the United States tick and made it so successful?
It was the idea of federalism and the U.S. Constitution that just guaranteed people rights, free speech, private property rights, free enterprise, and the fact that we really have 50, experiments in democracy running all the time. The 10th Amendment of the Constitution reserves all rights to the states, and that system has served the country very well. I think, as Lord Acton who said, American federalism, what's called federalism, is the key contribution that the United States made to the whole world. It was like building in decentralism into the fabric of government here, and it really did work. It kept conflicts at bay, with the exception of the Civil War, which is a catastrophe fought over slavery. But beyond that, its federalism has worked out very, very well for the country. Uh, uh, Everybody seems to agree that that was a brilliant system. But the centralization that we've seen pretty much, continually since 9/11 in the 21st century has dramatically changed the legal structure of the United States. And during that time, you've seen economic growth slow and cultural conflict rise, and then the U.S. became a global military empire when it was completely unnecessary. We could have pulled back on that after 1990. Instead, we started involving ourselves in a series of wars, and that just keeps continuing. We've got a Defense Department that's very much lobbying for more war, and military contractors pushing for more war. It's become, the nightmare that Eisenhower laid out in his farewell address, where he said, "Beware of the military-industrial complex." Well, now the military-industrial complex is driving the U.S. to really to a point where the empire is seems to be almost at an end. We seem to be going the way of other great empires in history, whether it's the Aztecs or the Portuguese or the Spanish or the British.
Wow. So that kind of summary, Jeffrey, would you have an incredible network. In many respects, you're an insider in so many both academic and government circles. Would you say that that's a kind of an emerging opinion, or is it
Yeah,
commonly held? How would you characterize this?
it's commonly held. I mean, everybody sort of knows it's happening. The problem is that nobody's powerful enough to do anything about it. It's a remarkable case study in the decline of a great country.
Wow.
It's not that one person's causing it to happen.
Hmm.
But ever more Americans are looking for somebody to come along and save us.
Wow.
That's why the interest in politics is so intense right now,
Hmm.
and yet, you hate to be in that situation as a country where you're just waiting for a political savior to arrive.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
that seems to be where we are right now. I'm not. I don't think that any one politician can somehow solve the problem, but maybe can revive some hopes, and then we can rebuild the country. I mean, it's not doomed yet. We're not really at that point, but it
Hmm.
does seem like all the pieces are in place right now for a real unfolding of a mess. And if the dollar really is unseated as the international reserve currency, it's going to change a lot of things about the way the U.S. conducts its business around the world and at home.
Okay, so we want to get to a number of those components, including the state of the economy and certainly the whole reference to the dollar as well. Um, but I wanted to just talk a little bit about the response or what happened during COVID-19 in the United States, because the world really watched so many of those decisions that were unfolding week by week, if not day
Mhm.
by day. And it's almost like is that a case study of a symptom of the decline of the United States? Or what the heck happened from your perspective as COVID-19 unfolded? It's hard to believe it's some 3 years ago.
Yeah, we spent a lot of time at Brownstone just trying to figure this out as best we can tell. In late January, uh, Anthony Fauci, together with Jeremy Farrar in the UK from the Wellcome Trust, began to get worried that a lab that they were funding in Wuhan might have leaked a virus. And when I say they were funding it, they were using a third party called EcoHealth Alliance. So Farrar and Fauci began to get worried that they were going to be blamed for having started, basically World War III. Like if this was a bioweapon or perceived to be a bioweapon, it was a disaster. So they put into place this sort of pandemic uh, planning apparatus, contacting the FBI and so on, and in the first week of February, and thinking that this virus was probably going to be much worse than it ended up being. And they saw the response in China with the lockdowns and advocated those for the United States. So that planning took place the whole month of February 2020, and then they just had to get Trump to sign off on it, and they did that by going to him on March 10th and saying, "Mr. President, this is much worse than you know. This could be a bioweapon for China, but the good news is that we sequenced it back in January, so we've got the antidote in the form of vaccine, which we're going to probably get by the summer, and then we'll distribute to everybody, and everybody will be saved from this." So they tapped into sort of Trump's, I would say, ignorance about cell biology, and he, like many people, have seen plenty of zombie apocalypse movies, and pandemic movies, and the idea that he was going to save the whole country from a bad virus made in China with an American-made vaccine Just it was too good to resist. So he gave the green light on lockdowns. And at that moment, this would have been, basically March 10th, 2020. 3 days later, well, 2 days later, we got the international travel restrictions. So you couldn't even travel from Canada to the US or anywhere in the world to the US. And then the next day, it was the national emergency was declared, and the Department of Health and Human Services transferred all rulemaking power to the National Security Council, which then turned it over to the Department of Defense and the Federal Emergency Management Administration. So we basically entered into national law and martial law at that point, and Trump basically ceased to be president. And he didn't know that, but he was pretty much a marionette on the stage for the rest of the year leading up to the
Wow.
elections.
Now, you've taken a lot of time to research this, Jeffrey. Like this is, you've gone through almost hour by hour the kind of documentation to essentially look back and see what happened. Is that right?
hmm Yeah, yeah, that's right. And it's taken 3 years to be able to tell the story I just told. It was basically 3 years of research from a very large team.
Wow.
And not everything can be proven, that I said. Part of the reason is that once it becomes a national security matter, then you've got this cloak of secrecy that enters into everything. So,
Okay. So part of that story then, Jeffrey, is just to recap quickly. Then, the virus came out, so we knew pretty early on that it likely came from the Wuhan lab. Uh,
mhm.
in fact, there's connections to the lab with the national lab in Canada, in Winnipeg, of all places. And what's clear is that I guess the question is, was it deliberate or was it accidental, or does it really matter?
So this is where it gets really fuzzy. It's a consequence of gain of function research. The way gain of function research works is that you've got epidemiologists and virologists and things trying to get ahead of the new variant of viruses as a way of testing vaccines. So you create a new virus, and then you sequence that virus, and then you create a shot that somehow mitigates against it. And it's a kind of a game they play in the name of uh, virus mitigation. The problem is that this gain of function research is bleeds over very seriously to the secretive area of bioweapons research. So they both go together. So you've got on one hand, the claim that they're doing this research for purposes of public health. On the other hand, you have a great deal of interest in this kind of research for purposes of biowarfare also. So, you know, either creating or anticipating the creation of a pathogen that
Hmm.
some hostile foreign power is going to make. So it becomes very dangerous. And I guess there's a consensus out there that the leak in Wuhan was unintentional, but they didn't know that at the time. In fact, what's kind of interesting is that on one hand, you had Fauci and Farrar and public health officials denying that it was a lab leak from
Hmm.
the first week of February 2020. On the
That's
other
right.
hand, believing that it was and telling Trump that it was. So you had,
Mm.
you had two stories, going at once. Now, the great mistake here is the belief that even if it came from a lab, even if it was created in a lab, even if it was released deliberately, was that that this new pathogen could somehow evade the natural built-in limits on all sorts of virus spread. We've known for at least a century there's a sort of dynamic that takes place within viruses that the more severe they are, the less they spread, and the more they spread, the less severe they are. So there's a kind of a trade-off working there. And so they somehow believed that this one could be so bad that it was going to evade every known limit
Hmm.
to virus spread, that it could be both highly transmissible and highly severe, which is we've never seen anything like that. So they were really making things up as they went along. And then I think even from Fauci's point of view, once once the National Security Council was put in charge of the virus response, and he called the FBI, and this whole kind of industry of pandemic planning got into gear. Nobody could control it. Certainly
Hmm.
not CDC and Fauci. And Fauci was just found himself just sort of playing along
Hmm.
with everything as it went along, just for purposes of political damage control.
Hmm.
Um, and so it was, a bureaucratic foul up for the ages. I mean, dwarfing even World War One. It was just a disaster. Even today, you can't find anybody who's willing to take responsibility for everything that happened.
No,
It's
it's truly stunning. It's almost like peeling a perennial onion. There's so many layers to this. So, at one layer, the the sense was that the virus was like out of a horror movie where it
Yeah.
was going to be like the Spanish flu. But
Mhm.
didn't we know, Jeffrey, fairly early on, within a few months, that the mortality rate was quite low? And that it was really focused on the vulnerable, namely older people with a lot of health issues.
Yeah.
Is that not accurate?
Uh, China was giving us a different impression of this virus than back in January. But by the middle of February, it was public knowledge that this thing was highly transmissible, but not very severe. And we
Mm.
knew the age gradient of death, and certainly from the Diamond Princess um, cruise liner, we knew exactly what it was, and nothing's changed about that. The average age of death from COVID uh, is is higher than the life expectancy, and typically with two or three comorbidities. So, they feared a pandemic. They developed a pandemic response. Then they had to create one, and they did it through a series of tools, things like the PCR test, which was used in Canada and the U.S. and all over the
Hmm.
world, which detects the presence of a virus, but it doesn't protect, but doesn't it doesn't detect actual sickness. In other words, it finds um, what we used to call infections, but not cases.
Right,
But
right.
that was mutated. There were some studies that were done even in March and April of 2020 showing that the false positives for these PCR tests approached 90%. And then you had the problem that once, okay, so now we've got cases spreading all over what they call cases spreading all over the place. Now they had to produce deaths, too. And
Hmm.
so then you had this misclassification, taking place, and tremendous financial incentives for hospitals and doctors to classify everything as COVID, and
So
then
what do you mean by that, Jeffrey? Just to clarify, for the lay listener, like you're saying financial incentives to label a death as COVID related?
oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. That's one of the problems is the U.S. shut down all of its hospital systems, so hospitals all over the country were bleeding money. Their parking lots were empty. 300 hospitals in this country furloughed nurses because they didn't have any patients. Most hospitals make money from elective surgeries; those were canceled, so they were bleeding financially. It was a disaster was unfolding. So when the government came along with a rescue package, it said, for everybody who dies of COVID, hospital gets an extra $7,000 from the government. Okay, so now you've got an incentive. So people die all the time, but if you can detect the presence of the virus uh, with a PCR test, then you can classify it as a COVID death.
Hmm.
So to this day, we still really don't have any idea of how many people actually died of COVID. It might be a really low number. We
Wow.
we do know that millions of people were classified as having died of COVID. I mean, there's no question there's a tremendous amount of death, but whether it was COVID that caused it is another question. I mean, the panic alone led to mass death, certainly in the northeast of the United States from March and April of
Hmm.
2020. In modern U.S. history, we've had three or four, five pretty severe pandemics in the course of the 20th century, and we never responded with anything like lockdowns. The
No,
first thing you
exactly.
do in the case of when there's new pathogens out there, is you try to figure out how to get them well. Well, the U.S. didn't do that. Because there was so much pressure on the vaccine makers. Everything was designed to wait for the vaccine, wait for the
Mhm.
vaccine. Well, the vaccine didn't come out until second half of November 2020, and then it turned out the vaccine didn't work. So it's just
And when you say the vaccine didn't work, do you mean in the sense that it did not prevent transmission, or did it? Because I think a common perception is that the vaccines were somehow successful because
yeah.
they made your symptoms, if you got sick, less severe.
That's what they say. But the problem is that we knew pretty early on it doesn't protect you from getting COVID. So there was that, and then that they last, that whatever benefits that they have, are really short term. We're talking about 2 or 3 months. So it doesn't protect against transmission, meaning that there wasn't actually a public benefit to the vaccines. There might have been a private benefit in some rare cases where you get some protection for 2 or 3 months, 2 weeks following the administration of the vaccine. But that protection is only relevant for those people who otherwise would have experienced severe medical outcomes. So for the
Mhm,
cohort of the population, which is something like 98%, that did not have severe medical outcomes from COVID, the vaccine proved pointless altogether. And
mhm,
then you had the other problem that the vaccine gave rise to immune imprinting, meaning that it rewires your immune system to only resist that one pathogen, one variant of a pathogen, but made you vulnerable to all these other kinds of
mhm.
pathogens that happen to be coming along,
So,
including
so the
variants.
vaccines to this day have significant impacts that we're still trying to assess.
Yeah. Well, then the adverse impacts of the vaccines by themselves are far higher than any vaccine that's ever been on the market. So all these things kind of played together. Um, and I've run articles on Brownstone with people even questioning, the claim that it was ultimately beneficial for even the most severe cases that lessened them, and the data is still not clear on that. All these studies I've seen that claim that the vaccine saved a lot of lives are based on modeling exercises with built-in parameters, not really clinical trials and
Mhm,
not random control trials. They're just purely modeling exercises designed
mhm.
to make it look as if we made the right decisions. But it's not clear that vaccines actually saved lives overall, and that might have led to excess mortality. For one thing, the vaccines seem to, all the data we have suggests that the more vaccinated the population is, the more susceptible it was to reinfection from new variants. So it actually had the opposite effect.
So it seems like this has been a policy disaster in terms of the management of COVID-19. And one of the things that has always been a puzzle for me is that knowing a little bit about the drug approval process with the Federal Drug Administration, and Canada's often looked to that organization as kind of the gold standard in the world in terms of drug
Hmm.
approval, and it takes often years. 5, 10 years often to get a drug approved, but we didn't do that here. We looked to the United States, and the United States approved it so quickly. So what
Hmm.
the heck happened? Was it because they put it through a military process and not a
Hmm.
civilian one? What
Yeah,
happened?
that's right. They dispensed with all the normal trials you would have on a vaccine or any pharmaceutical, and gave it a status what they call emergency use authorization, which is that
Mm,
this is too important. We've just got to go ahead. And the belief was that uh, so there's one type of vaccine that got privileged status over everything else, and it was this mRNA platform, which they have been working on for 30 years. And the idea of mRNA is it works a little bit like firmware on your computer. You can just rewrite the code depending on the
mhm.
pathogens. That's why they're able to get it out so fast, because they're using mRNA. But it's the first time mRNA has ever been tested on the population.
So
So
it's the first
yeah,
time that that
yeah,
new technology was used on a population.
that's right. That's right. And the hope was that it was going to work so well that we'd be able to solve pandemics for everyone forever, because we'd have such a good case, such a good demonstration of this beautiful new technology. Well, the technology completely failed. So now there's a serious problem. And of course, all the companies that produce these mRNA vaccines for COVID were indemnified against any kind of damages, so they can't be sued really. Um, and as far as we know, they were pretty upfront in the trials, and we were going through all the trial documents. The adverse effects were just off the charts for especially pregnant women, and all sorts of population cohorts. Myocarditis was already present in the trials, but
Mhm.
that didn't get any attention. All we got was the public claim that it was 95% effective, which doesn't mean really anything. It turns out you'd think it would mean something, but it doesn't actually. So it was a huge mess, and the incredible thing about it is that you see very little talk about this. It's almost like it's
Mhm.
still a taboo subject,
Right.
even in the U.S. today.
Yeah, and yet so much of this is discoverable through careful research and
Mhm.
even public record, but also through a lot of conversation behind the scenes. Is that right, Jeffrey? In terms of your research?
Yeah, yeah. There's plenty of people who know, and plenty of people who are writing about it all the time. But it's being widely censored in the
Mhm.
mainstream press,
Well,
and in part because the vaccine companies themselves are highly lucrative and are supportive, provide supportive advertising for all the major media. So we've got a
mhm,
strange situation where we've got a taboo. Everybody knows you're not supposed to talk about it, but everybody kind of knows about it. It's
mhm.
very strange.
So, in terms of the United States now, as we look at the management of COVID 19, we know now a lot of things that were asserted from the get go that were clearly not accurate or correct anymore to this day. There are assertions around mask wearing and the effectiveness of that, to that vaccines were the only answer when in fact there were alternative therapies available.
Mhm.
And you should really consult with your doctor, but instead the state kind of intervened between that doctor patient relationship. I mean, the list goes on and on. Even the whole narrative that we wouldn't really respect natural immunity for people with low risks here. Um, so, what is your insight as to why so many of those narratives, those messages from government, time and time again, including in Canada, were just entirely wrong? Like, how did that happen?
Well, one of the problems was that the emergency use authorization for the vaccines was only allowed on the condition that there were no alternatives available. So, in order to get the EUA, they had to deprecate and diminish the all known fixes for these kinds of mild
Wow.
respiratory infections.
Sorry, can you repeat that again? So you had to go down a certain decision-making path to
Yeah.
assume that there was no other treatment alternatives.
That's right. So because they had to assume there's no alternative treatment, suddenly there wasn't any alternative treatments. I mean, things
Oh,
like
that's absurd.
ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine were all taken off the market as early as December and January. These are widely prescribed drugs for these kinds of infections, widely used, and suddenly you couldn't find them. Every alternative to vaccines was hard to get. I mean, as incredible as that seems, and this
Wow.
was just solely to comply with the terms of the EUA.
Jeffrey, I know that you have very much not only an American perspective, but an international one as well. So, if I may ask you, why did Canada, nations such as Canada, among so many others, go
Mhm.
along with this kind of mimicking, in many ways, the U.S. reaction to COVID 19? Like,
Yeah, that
who would
was,
ever
and
believe?
I think you described it well. It was a mimicking of the U.S. I mean, once the U.S. did this, then it sent out the signal to statesmen all over the world, you should do this too.
Mhm,
And that's a major reason why Latin America locked down, and a major reason why Canada, and then finally Britain locked down.
mhm.
Really, uh, just unbelievable calamity. Well, from my perspective, seeing Canada go this direction, and for that matter, Australia and New Zealand too, a lot of the Commonwealth countries did this, was really disappointing
Mhm.
because Canada has typically avoided all the bouts of political hysteria that you see in the U.S.
Mhm.
I mean, Canada was a great refuge for people during the conscription years of the Vietnam War. I mean, a
That's
lot
right.
of Americans went to Canada because Canada had this reputation for being a peaceful country
Mhm.
without a lot of weird frenzies, where
Right.
you have freedom and rights. I mean, sort of the social, the more welfare state policies, and
Mhm.
socialized medicine, that sort of thing, but
You're
just
more
generally
civilized,
respect,
Jeffrey.
yeah, generally respecting people's rights. So to see Canada go this direction was kind of devastating. And then Canada, uh, uh, kept the lockdowns longer than the U.S.
Mhm.
and actually became more extremist violation of civil liberties and civil rights and freedom of speech. And we saw what happened to the truckers. So, that was devastating, I think, for me and for many people. Americans look to Canada to be a normal country,
Mhm.
a happy, peaceful place where everybody's nice and where weird things don't happen. That's what Americans think of Canada.
It's quite remarkable, that perspective. So, speaking of the trucker convoy, the Freedom Convoy, um, what kind of impact do you think that made in the United States and elsewhere?
Well, it had a big impact on Canadian culture. I know this because all my Canadian friends tell me that really did break the lockdowns.
Hmm.
Even though there's not been any admission that the truckers are right all along,
Hmm.
it did shatter the sense, and they had a great deal of support, despite what the polls said. There was a tremendous amount of support for the truckers. And in the U.S., I mean, the truckers, had a huge popularity here in the U.S. too. So it had a big impact. So in many ways, the truckers just kind of sent up a warning to the whole English speaking world that we're not going to put up with this stuff, that we're regular working men and women, and you're taking our rights away,
Hmm.
and we're not going to go along with it. That was a very important turning point, I would say, for the U.S. For sure.
Hmm.
Um, the truckers did attempt some rallies in the U.S., but not as successfully.
Hmm.
Partially, the reason for that is that the crackdown in Canada was so brutal, particularly the confiscation of assets and the freezing of bank accounts and that kind of stuff. A lot of Americans just got scared.
Yeah,
So, but I think
I think
when
you're
the
right.
history is written, the Canadian the freedom the freedom protests of the truckers in Canada really did it was a turning point, a real save. They were the saviors of the world. They took a lot of risks, but they did it for reasons of principle.
It's really truly inspiring, and I think it's also kind of amazing because, ironically, the prime minister instituted these mandates on independent truckers, and there didn't seem to be any evidence or issues with health concerns with them. To
Right.
this day, we can't find any.
Hmm.
And clearly, in retrospect, it's very clear that there were communications showing that this was a kind of a cynical, dare I say, political wedge strategy to try to vilify a certain group of society, so that you could then further position the prime minister and their government as being safeguards of public health safety, when in
Yeah.
fact that's not what it was about. It was a political strategy, and I think that that kind of vilification of that population was incredibly unjust, and I think that was also another wake up call, I think, for many Canadians and people around the world, quite frankly.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and I assume there's going to be some political fallout from this. In fact, we've only begun to see the political fallout. I mean, I think Trudeau is not as popular as he once was, but it's more than that. Canadians and Americans are deeply suspicious of the entire administrative state apparatus and what their plans are for
Hmm.
us for the future. So I think the political fallout from this thing is we're just beginning to see it. I mean, they're not going to make it go away. They can't
Yeah,
make it go away. I
that's
was
right.
at a rally yesterday for Robert Kennedy Jr., who's thrown his hat into the presidential
Hmm.
ring. He's already polling at 14% among people who voted for Biden
Wow.
in 2020, and his speech was very compelling. There were 3,000 people there, and they couldn't have fit any more in. If they could have, there would have been 10,000 or 20,000 people there. It was very powerful, and he's making the COVID response really at the very center of his campaign,
Isn't
and
that
and
something?
and trying to bring back a sense of old fashioned you know 1950s 1960s style American patriotism.
Mhm.
So there's a lot
So
of
this is
people that are
Robert
drawn to him.
Kennedy Jr., who's announced his presidential campaign just recently.
Yeah.
So you would see him as an interesting candidate within the Democratic Party today when he's
Yeah.
polling at, you said, 14%.
Yep, yeah, and it's just going to go up from there. He's very articulate, and he's seeking a vision that a lot of people are really rallying around, which is to stand up to the bureaucracies, take back the country from the administrative apparatus, bring home the troops, start caring for the middle class instead of conducting these policies that only benefit the very
Mhm.
rich. It was a very compelling speech. It lasted nearly 2 hours, and the whole room is electrified by his presence.
Isn't that
So
something? I,
yeah, so he could be leading a real revolution within the Democrats too. I mean, we tend to forget this, but average Democrats do not support what the Biden administration is doing.
sorry, can you repeat that? I think a lot of Canadians would be shocked to hear that.
Yeah, the Democratic Party is very diverse, and it doesn't just consist, as Robert Kennedy said, of neoconservatives with woke bobbleheads. That's why he put it yesterday. It was a hilarious line. And most Democrats, love their country and support the working classes and poor and the middle classes, and just want their rights and freedoms back. So, RFK's entry into this race is enormously disruptive. I mean, he's the son of Robert Kennedy, who was shot
Yes.
in 1968, and the nephew of John F. Kennedy, who
Hmm.
was shot in 1963. So he's got, a little bit. He's got the look and feel of a crown prince, really, in a
Hmm.
monarchical sense,
Hmm.
and he talks a very good game. I mean, he really is very impressive, and he says that his campaign is all about you know the truth instead of the lies from the mainstream media and the government we've been getting for 3 years. So it's very compelling. And, I think we still have some semblance of democracy in this country, as far as I know. And his election could really take off. Now he's been attacked, brutally by the mainstream press. But that same kind of thing played itself out in 2016 with Trump, and Trump won anyway. So could that same thing happen to the Democrats? I mean, maybe. We'll see.
Very interesting. So, one of the revelations that we found through this last few years has been the world of censorship and the
Mhm.
censorship industrial complex, if you will. It's really quite stunning. So, to cut to the chase, so Elon Musk's purchase of Twitter and all the associated Twitter files, did Elon Musk buy a crime scene?
Well, what he found, he thought he was buying a business, and instead he found that it was a surveillance tool for the government. He just couldn't believe it, so he ended up, firing 80%. 4 out of 5 employees
Isn't that
uh, are
remarkable?
are just gone from the place, and he's doing his best to turn it into a free speech platform. It's really the only mainstream social media that's not completely crawling with FBI agents at this point.
Hmm. No,
So,
I think most people, my anecdotal conversations with so many Canadians, I think many people are frankly not aware of this censorship reality that at the
yeah,
core of it, based again in the United States, you have most of the social media platforms deeply censored,
yeah.
search platforms, everything. And then you have the mainstream media, which largely beams into Canada. So a lot of Canadians get a steady diet of mainstream media, let alone from their own media that has largely been funded by the federal government. You have a great deal of censorship and manipulation of virtually everything. It's really
Mhm.
quite stunning, isn't it?
And Twitter is now the only mainstream platform that is not subject to that level of control, and I hope it lasts. I mean,
Hmm.
because it's glorious actually to remember what it was like to be able to say something, and not get censored for it. But that censorship is pervasive on every other platform, whether it's LinkedIn or Facebook or Instagram or any of the rest of them. Google is wholly captured at this point.
Yeah.
So this is a disaster for big tech.
Hmm.
We didn't know going into this whole thing just how closely tied big tech was to big government and big media. Now we see them all as united in a pro censorship, sort of uh, propaganda effort, just a big hegemon designed to control the public mind. Uh, I mean, will it work? I don't know. Maybe, but but we'll see. I mean, people are starting to get really educated about this now in ways they weren't 3 years ago.
Mhm. So, just to recap there, Jeffrey, is that you've done a lot of research into this, as others are rapidly, but the infrastructure involved is, what is it, 18 military and industrial actors have really been censoring across this network. It's really quite major in its scale and how sophisticated it really is, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, free speech is really important to a functioning democracy. If they shut that down, everything else, all your rights and liberties are gone. So that's why the American framers put free speech as the very first amendment in the Bill of Rights. It's the most important
Precisely.
thing.
That's right.
And we've got a lot of litigation taking place right now. People are suing the government for what they've done over the last 3 years, and we'll see if it's going to be successful, but it very well could be. And if that happens, that'd be great. My concern with these lawsuits, I'm really happy about them, is that they don't seem to be scaring the government or the other social media platforms very much, because they're continuing the same old practices
Mhm.
that they started 3 years ago, and those still persist today.
Well, and this is what I was going to ask you about, Jeffrey, is that it seems like things are speeding up on the other side. Instead
Hmm.
of backing away from more state control, they're increasing it.
Hmm.
Instead of backing away and kind of coming forward and saying, gosh, we're sorry about the mistakes about COVID 19. Gosh, we're sorry about all the censorship that we've employed from top
Yeah,
to bottom. No, it's a doubling down of these
yeah,
efforts, isn't it?
that's right. And the consequence is a mass loss of trust in all of our institutions, and this is going to continue until these people admit error, but they never will. So you've got right now a kind of an establishment in all countries, the U.S. and all Commonwealth countries, of a great deal of distrust towards an establishment. They know it, so they're
Hmm.
getting scared. They're afraid of public anger at this point, so it gives them ever more reason to crack down.
Hmm.
So we're really at a turning point. We're really at the point of. I feel like I'm quoting RFK from his speech yesterday, but we have to decide, what kind of people we are. Do we have rights and liberties and a normal functioning democracies,
Hmm.
or are we just going to plunge into this dystopian world of mass surveillance and population controls, in which the real rulers are not people you elect, but the very rich working with deep state administrative bureaucrats to destroy any semblance of democracy, the rule of law. That seems to be what's going on. So this is a real turning point for all countries. I mean, like, we have to decide, like, right away, or else it's going to be too late.
No, I agree. So we really are at a turning point, a fork in the road, if you will, in
Hmm.
terms of what kind of nations we're going to be. And it really begs the question then, how do we renew our countries, keeping in mind those kind of foundational assumptions that have made our country so successful, like the rule of law, for instance. It's
Yeah.
truly remarkable.
Well, and the part of the pathway is, speaks to your comments earlier about the truckers. They were passionate enough and naive enough to stick their necks out and stand up for right and wrong, for truth, and they were enormously successful by any standard. So you're going to have this more and more. These people just saying, "Look, I want to hand off the country of my birth to my children, that's still free and functioning and prosperous." And if and I in order to do that, going to have to take certain actions. I'm going to have to really start caring about the future and be hopeful that something can change. I see that there will come a tipping point politically in both Canada and the U.S. and around the entire West, where we're going to have to stand up and say no to this, to what's happening to us. If we don't do it now, um, we're going to be doomed. And we see the way the BRICS nations, that's Brazil and China and Saudi Arabia and uh, and Russia, all kind of coalescing together to create a real trade zone, and to sink really the U.S. and Europe and Canada and Australia uh, into oblivion, and that's really where we are right now, and for the first time, it seems like they can actually succeed. So we've got to get our act together, like fast. And the way to do it is it's not too complicated. We just have to rally around the core principles that have built these nations into powerful, functioning, prosperous democracies in the past. You know, the Constitution, the Bills of Rights, and the rights and liberties that we've all taken for granted for so long until they decided to take them away from us.
I
That
think you're
has
right on, Jeffrey. I think speaking of tipping points and or ways to rally people together as citizens has to do also with things such as the economy.
hmm
So I did want to reflect with you just briefly on that a little bit because it is such a huge topic. But when you
yeah,
think of the impact that inflation is having on people's lives, it's decimating many elements of the middle class.
yeah.
Um, it's disturbing, and so you have this. I think just last week you had polls in Canada released that some 60% of Canadians realize that the main culprit behind creating inflation is it's federal governments and other levels of government that are spending too much money.
hmm
They have a war on conventional fossil fuel industry
hmm
that is just driving their costs through the roof. And then you have this bizarre notion of modern monetary theory, where you
hmm
have endless deficits and you can spend as much money as you want. So your stake gets bigger and bigger. So you have this bizarre situation where you have a whole class of people that are insulated from the economy because they're on, they're employed to the state, and yet working people are getting hammered by inflation. So is it the same thing in the United States where people are waking up to the reality that these people in charge aren't doing a good job?
For the last 28 months, the dollar has declined in value very dramatically. We've lost about 16 cents from the dollar as it stood in January of 2020. So it's a very dramatic and painful inflation, which is a tax on the middle class and the poor. There was
Mhm.
no way they couldn't have anticipated this. You know, starting in March of 2020 and continuing all the way uh, to the same point a year later, the Federal Reserve created about $6.3 trillion in new money. And that was to buy the debt that was generated by the excess spending by Congress. And that was fed directly into individual bank accounts and then landed into the banking system. And that watered down the value of all the existing dollars. It's not a complicated story.
Mhm.
And then the Federal Reserve panicked about that and started raising rates. Have had the fastest increase in interest rates on record because they were starting at zero, and now they've got to get it higher than the existing inflation rates, which were at something like 4.5% right now. Inflation's still running hotter than that,
Mhm.
so they're not done yet. We're real interest rates in on the left side of the yield curve are still in negative territory. So we're not done with this war on inflation. But those interest rate increases have had a devastating impact on the banks because it devalued their
Mhm.
existing portfolios, which were mostly held in the form of fixed rate bonds, and
Right.
so they were devalued. At the same time, the higher costs of servicing the debt, they were rising for many industries and started pulling down more deeply on their cash balances. And that led to a kind of a banking crisis that the Federal Reserve jumped in, and the U.S. Treasury Department jumped in to bail out the banks.
Mhm.
So we stopped that hemorrhage about a month ago, but we're not done with the problem yet, and the inflation's still an issue. So they're going to have to still increase rates, and we're seeing now a dramatic decline in M2, the
Mhm.
quantity of money, dramatic decline as a result of the Federal Reserve selling off its own assets to rebalance its balance sheet. At the same time, banks cannot find a market for their excess cash that they developed over the pandemic period, so their loans are declining, and all these forces are at work to cause the money supply to drop.
Mhm.
We're at about a 5% drop right now. We don't know what the implications of that are going to be. We don't really have any experience with this. The last time the money supply dropped this much was between 1929 and 1932. That was a 15% drop, and it led to the what we call the Great Depression. So we're at 5% right now, but in a quantitative sense, is a much larger drop. So we don't know what the implications are going to be. The newest housing data came out showing huge declines in new home purchases as a result of the higher interest rates. So it's impacting every aspect of economic life.
Hmm.
Uh, Producer prices came out last week that were dramatically lower than consumer prices. So you've got this huge opening between the two. Producer prices are falling at the
Hmm.
same time consumer prices are rising. Now, my read on the situation over the last 3 years is that we've got about a 3 or 4 month lag between
Hmm.
the two, and what that means is that the CPI could be settling down a little bit more by the summer. But at the same token, there's every indication, based on all the data I'm looking at, that by the summer we're going to be solidly in recession at the same time. So
Hmm.
there's going to be an overlapping period where we're going to have both recession,
Yeah.
very deep and noticeable recession, along with persistent inflation in the consumer goods sector. So
This is the term that economists use as stagflation. Is that
yeah,
correct,
yeah,
Jeffrey?
and that could last between the summer and then going into the winter of
Hmm.
this year. So so hard times are coming, and we don't. What's on the other side of that? We don't entirely know. How deep will the recession go? Um, how will they deal with it? Are they going to engage in another round of quantitative easing? We don't really know. They're pretty scary times. This is like error piled on error. The
Hmm.
monetary policy during the
Right.
COVID period is very much like it's pandemic policy. It's just one mistake after another, and every new action designed to correct for the
Hmm.
previous action, but then creating more reactions. And it's just this kind of a spiral is taking place.
No, it is truly a kind of a slow train wreck, and I would agree with your kind of economic summary. So we're kind of headed, and I think this is in Canada's case as well. We're headed, if we're not in a recession already, um, to a time where inflation will persist, but our economy will be slower.
Hmm.
And so this is very concerning. But in this context, so many of us have a number of debates, and I'm curious whether this is the case in the United States as well. We're given these poor choices by decision makers. Um, how did we get into this situation? Is it because that the the state bureaucrats are in charge and will never back away from spending more money with um, corrupt politicians of sorts who always want to spend more money? I mean, we have a prime minister who's articulated the idea that the budget will balance itself. I mean, it's just totally absurd. So,
Yeah.
in this context, I guess my question is this deliberate or is this just incompetence? Because some cynically will say, well, this is all part of this bizarre sense of a global reset, and that's why
Mhm.
this is deliberate. Where do you shake out on that?
I don't know. I don't know if it's deliberate or not. Certainly, there are certain people out there that claim, "Oh, this is all. This everything's happening according to a plan."
Right.
It looks
Yeah.
to me like just pure chaos and also opportunism by
Yes.
large
Yeah.
corporations working with governments to kind of strip mine the entire middle class.
Hmm.
Essentially, what's happening? They're just benefiting themselves, and they don't
Right.
care about the impact. You think about something like during lockdowns, the online shopping industry just had a heyday. I mean, they were so happy
Hmm.
because they were able to drive out all their competition. Well, millions of small businesses in this country and probably Canada too were utterly destroyed and didn't come back. Uh, and meanwhile, the online shopping industry just thrived. That's very cynical use of their political connections, but they were happy to do it just for the sake of gaining an edge over their competition. So these are
Exactly.
very short-sighted policies because you can't live like no country can really thrive without a thriving small business sector.
Hmm.
Nobody wants to live in that kind of dystopia, but that's
Right.
exactly what they've created, but
Yeah.
all
So
celebrated and defended by the media.
yes, right. And so you have these myriad of interests really pushing for their short-term interests.
Yeah,
You think of big pharma selling an awful lot of product. Well, okay, is it really serving society?
right.
Um, so the economy and all the associated pain with it, Jeffrey, could be a real wake-up call for society to say something
Mhm.
is wrong if they don't know that already.
Right. And now, historically, when you enter into, with a politically divided country and a shattered people who are in very ill health as a result of lockdowns, going into an economic inflationary depression at the same time, that usually doesn't end well.
Yeah.
So
Oh,
this
brutal.
is this is the worry. So
Uh,
this is why we need
yeah.
a really good leadership right now, and we do have those people out there. I know Canada has some good leaders, political leaders that are in the wings. They're
Mhm,
marginalized and attacked and denounced by
mhm,
the mainstream press, but they're good. And the U.S. has several voices out there now with Ron
mhm,
DeSantis and RFK now.
mhm,
But it's not enough. But it's a
mhm.
start, and at least gives some measure of hope.
Indeed, it is. I think the other thing that is fascinating to watch in the United States is also, if you think of triggers again, is the whole application of law these days. I think it's been stunning for many people to watch. I'm not sure to what degree Canadians recognize this, but it has to do with the rule of law and the weaponization of law. And I've seen this for quite some time. Is the so-called area of lawfare, where you essentially use the law as a weapon
Hmm.
to essentially criminalize your opponent. So we think of Donald Trump, the former president, um, among so many other examples. It's really stunning, the long list. But is this now commonly understood that? I mean, I've yet to see a legal analysis in the United States, and I know that Donald Trump has all his stylistic challenges and communication. He's kind of a mixed bag. But in the case of Donald Trump's indictment by, what is it, the Manhattan Attorney General there, um, it is utterly farcical.
Hmm.
It's bizarre. I can't find a single legal analysis that would support it, and yet
Right.
it's going ahead in some fashion. I know the other day it was batted down in some measure, but how do you see these things? And now we just have an IRS, Internal Revenue Service whistleblower that just came forward saying. There's a whole effort within the Justice Department not to prosecute a guy named Hunter Biden and the Biden family on all
Mhm.
kinds of criminal activity.
Yeah.
How do you view this?
Well, it's a tragedy for the United States because once a country loses trust in its justice system, where it just becomes so heavily politicized that people
Hmm.
just become cynical, you're giving rise to what could just end up in just pure chaos. So that's a problem that is got a very long term fix, and I don't know entirely what it is. I mean, the courts are just so clogged up right now with litigation. This is going to go on for 10 years or 20 years as a
Hmm.
result of the last three. And the decisions that the decisions that judges are making are entirely influenced by who's paying them or what their
Hmm.
political ideology is. So the enforcement of the rule of law has really slipped like dramatically, and we've always believed that we had fair systems of justice. But when you see the former president being dragged before this court in Manhattan over these ridiculous claims
Hmm.
that are just embarrassing, that he violated campaign finance law by not reporting a transaction as a campaign finance law. As you say, there's no legal analysis that could justify this all. It's just pure political persecution,
Hmm.
banana republic style
Yeah,
stuff.
it really is tragic. So, on that note, I did want to talk a little bit about elected elites, and I did want to get to a clip about quite a prominent political figure named Hillary Clinton, and she just gave an interview recently with I believe it was a UK reporter.
Next year, America goes to the polls. Donald Trump is running for president while under criminal indictment. This, the man who back in 2016 consistently accused you of law breaking and actively encouraged chants of lock her up directed at you. It's pretty ironic, isn't it, that he is now a former president that could face a jail term. How does it make you feel?
Well, I always thought about him, and if you follow him, I think you can see it as well. He accuses people of doing things he himself is doing. It's a form of psychological projection, and I always thought that his record in business in particular, but then as we saw him in politics and government, he was someone who cared nothing about rules, he cared nothing about the law. So he has been indicted, and there may be others as well, but he has said he's going to keep running, and there's nothing in our current system of laws that would prevent him from running. But even if he gets the Republican nomination, he cannot, in my view, be reelected president.
Why can't he be reelected
Because
if
I think
he gets the nomination?
I think people are, more people are on to him and his behavior than they were before. He has a hard core of support that is likely to help him win the Republican nomination. But in a general election against President Biden, I do not believe he can win.
So you don't think he can win? Do you think he's a bigger threat to Biden than DeSantis?
It's hard to tell. I mean, DeSantis is unproven. Nobody really outside of Florida knows very much about him. And in Florida, they're watching him do crazy things. So I actually believe that President Biden will be reelected, regardless of who the Republican nominee is.
Do you ever worry that President Biden, he will be in his 80s in a second term, is too old for the job?
I feel like I could do the job. I'm in, my mid-70s.
Yeah. Well, you could run in 2028.
Well, I doubt that.
So, Jeffrey, I found that interview fascinating on so many levels, but one of which is, does that mean that Hillary Clinton is signaling that she would like to run for president again, perhaps as we look at an aging Joe Biden, but possibly not continuing on?
Yeah, there's a number of these Democrats that are just, sort of hoping that something goes wrong, that Biden's going to drop out and they'll just jump in. Her comments are very revealing, and people need to listen to it very carefully. So what you get from that is the Democrats, and by extension, the administrative state and the big media and big tech and everything, desperately want Trump to win the Republican nomination. They want him to win that nomination because they believe, and she said it like twice, with great conviction, they believe that they can win against him. And they have good reason to believe that, based on his record in 2020 and then 2018, 2020, and 2022, that he does not carry a majority of voters and cannot even win a plurality of what you need to and that he could be the hand that finally destroys the Republican Party. They believe this. So that's why they're forever promoting his campaign with free media attention, and many people in the Republican Party are buying into it, But this is the plan. Now, I don't believe that Biden's going to make it all the way to the election. So other people are going to step up. So with RFK entering now, he's getting.
Okay, so just to clarify, Jeffrey, why don't you think President Biden will run for a second term?
Because for health reasons, and his heart's not in it, and he's just not up to it. But they need Trump to get the nomination, and then have Biden pull out at the last second before the convention. And then what they want is somebody like Newsom or Hillary Clinton or somebody like that to sweep in.
Okay, so Gavin Newsom is the governor of California.
California,
or Ron
right?
DeSantis, the governor of Florida.
He's basically the Justin Trudeau of California. I mean, he had huge amounts of lockdowns while singing the praises of freedom and rights and that sort of thing. I'm just like a man who's capable of saying anything and is able to pretend as if reality doesn't exist. That kind of political figure. But he's very popular among the Democrats, so it could be a Newsom Hillary Clinton ticket, and they'll hope that can beat a Trump ticket, because that'll rally the Democrats, and then they'll be in charge. And look, this scenario is not crazy. I mean, as terrifying as it sounds, it's not crazy.
Well,
That's where we're
it's
getting
amazing. Your past predictions on many things, Jeffrey, have been remarkably accurate. So we'll have to see.
to.
But I think an important point that you referenced was the state of the Democratic Party, in the sense that
Mhm.
it is very different than a Democratic Party that many Canadians would think of it as in the past, like the party of JFK as an example.
Mhm.
So the party, as you described it, if I was listening carefully, you said is almost like an extension of the managerial state. What did you mean by that?
The party elites, the Democratic National Committee, has been basically a marionette, just a cover for the public sector unions and the administrators of the government. And that's what it is at the top. Now, at the grassroots, the Democrats still believe in things like freedom of speech and defending the working class interests and in favor of spreading
Hmm.
prosperity to all classes and races and that sort of thing. But at the top, it's just become entirely captive of major corporations and technology companies and big farm above everything else. This makes a lot of Democrats really very uncomfortable. You think during my lifetime, the Democratic Party has never been allied so closely with big business.
Hmm.
That's completely different from what it used to be. Another thing that's really affecting the Democrats right now is what's called woke ideology.
Hmm.
The rallying around all these cultural hot button issues like trans rights
Hmm.
and telling regular Americans that they can't be proud of American history, that the founding fathers were all monsters. All this kind of extreme left wing rhetoric that's
Hmm.
never been part of the Democratic Party. Democrats are the party of Clinton and Carter and
Hmm.
JFK. So this is they're having this new perspective on life. It's woke ideology plus in favor of war with Russia, alongside this extremist views on everything else. Like wanting to shut down fossil fuel industry. Well,
Hmm.
that'll destroy the poor in this country.
Hmm.
And the middle class in this country. So a lot of Democrats are not willing to go along with this. So this is why this campaign by somebody like Robert Kennedy Jr. is potentially could be very disruptive because he
Hmm.
taps into a deeper sense of who we are and what we're supposed to believe. And so the Democrats could be the next party that would be disrupted in a similar way to what the Republicans were in 2016 when Trump came along
Hmm.
and basically wiped out the Reaganite attitudes of the past. He reshaped the party according to his image. It's very possible the same thing could happen to the Democrats if we still have democracy and if public opinion still matters.
Hmm. Well, so speaking of influences within all parties, including the Republican and Democratic Party, I think there's been a lot of revelations as well, as is in Canada, about the influence of the Chinese Communist Party within our societies. In fact, right now there's a lot of pressure on the federal government to actually do a proper public inquiry into the influence that
Mm,
the Chinese Communist Party has had on a number of key federal elections. It's really
mhm,
quite significant. So,
mhm.
is that debate emerging as well in the United States? Because if
Uh,
you look at the amount of money the Chinese and influence they've had through all kinds of things, including TikTok, it's profound in the United States, is it not?
yeah. I mean, the U.S. pursued the China-style CCP lockdowns, 3 years ago with COVID, and
Mhm.
the influence is very. You don't hear about it that much. Ron DeSantis talks about it to some extent. I think a lot of Republicans are very upset about it, but the Democrats are just turning the other direction, which is another difference between RFK and the regular Democrats. He's very concerned about CCP influence,
Mhm.
and my understanding of the Canadian situation is it's much worse in Canada than it is in the U.S.
Mhm.
But um, but it's really very alarming. Just the extent of CCP infiltration, which goes to the highest levels. And it certainly went to the highest levels in the Trump administration, or else they wouldn't have done what they did. I
Mhm.
mean, we don't know how many agents of the CCP are deeply embedded in all the bureaucracies, including at the National Security Council. It's tremendously alarming.
Hmm. Well, I think it's alarming as well. And the pattern of Chinese influences is not to pursue a kinetic or hot war, it's to pursue elite capture. Why would you have a war when you can just simply corrupt them in so many ways? Um, from my own personal experience, I'll never forget a conversation with very senior people within the RCMP years ago saying that their biggest challenge is frankly industrial espionage from the CPC. So it was a real revelation for me, and I think it's something that we as both Canadians and Americans and really around the world should not be naive to. Um, so I did want to pick up the thread then, Jeffrey, as we kind of get into the home stretch here about this long conversation about the state of the United States. Is the rise of the managerial class, the expert class that was in many respects in charge of so many of the last number of major decisions across the United States. If you look at the management of COVID-19, among other things, is it almost seems like there's a significant reduction in the confidence, the lack of trust in that expert class. Would you agree?
We have an administrative state in this country is enormously powerful. There are about 30 or 40,000 people who've never been elected to any public office that are the experts in their particular realm. They're deeply embedded in all the some 300 different agencies that are running the country, and then backed by an army of 2 to 3 million other employees that cannot be fired, that were not elected to their posts, but have enormous power over everybody's lives. And that's the fourth branch of government. You're not going to be able to find it in the U.S. Constitution. There's nothing about the administrative apparatus, but they've made such inroads over the
Mhm.
decades, and particularly since in the 21st century, that they're making the whole point of democracy kind of moot. I mean, the idea of democracy is that we control the government through our elected representatives. Well, if our elected representatives are completely outgunned and outclassed by and outsmarted by deeply embedded employees in all aspects of government, and they're making decisions about our lives, you've disabled the whole point of democracy.
Mhm.
So this subject has to be taken on. And Americans didn't, by the way, didn't even know that this was happening until very recently. It was the lockdowns that alerted us to the who are these people telling me to put plexiglass up on my in my business? How come I can't go to church? Who are these people telling me I have to wear a mask, even though I know the whole thing is ridiculous and that we've never been able to successfully control a pandemic through mask wearing? It just it's alarming how much power that they ended up having, and we didn't know about it. And I hope with this information, we're going to be able to engage in some kind of reform of the civil service. I mean, these people have to be. You have to, our elected leaders need to be in a position to control them, at least fire them, or
Mhm.
at least be able to judge their performance and insist that they follow the law rather than making their own law. Uh,
Indeed.
this is a huge subject.
So, like you, I'm a keen student of history, and I during this time, like we've examined so many areas around the state of the United States, from media to censorship and freedom of speech rights, the economy, and so forth. What the word tyranny comes to my mind.
Mhm.
I think of John Locke's book, The Second Treatise on Government, and if memory serves me correctly, on chapter 18, there's so many references around tyranny. Are we are we tilting towards? And I'm trying not to sound too dramatic or indeed
Mhm.
depressing, but are we tilting towards a tyranny, Jeffrey?
Well, I don't know what other term to use. I mean, despotism, Leviathan by big tech, big media. I mean, there's a lot of terms that you could throw out there, but
Hmm.
it's inconsistent with any traditional understanding of the word freedom. I mean, John Locke's Second Treatise on Government is a great book, and everybody should read it. What you'll find in there is the first template for the Declaration of Independence, where Thomas Jefferson and his colleagues just said flat out, when a government doesn't serve the people's interests and they've sent swarms of bureaucrats to eat out our substance, we have the right to change that government, to abolish the existing structures and to put in place new ones that are consistent with God-given rights. That's what Thomas Jefferson wrote.
Indeed.
He was
Yes.
he wrote that based entirely on his reading of John Locke's great book. So these are the kinds of books we need to revisit and act on and believe in again.
Indeed. So, as we look to the future, as we look to renewing the myriad of institutions that need to be renewed, that we've talked about, what are the recommendations for actions that we can all take, particularly citizens?
I think the most important thing that regular citizens need to do is to learn to take care of their own lives and their families and their communities first. That's more important than any political action. Getting involved with your local merchants, giving them your business, making friends at your houses of worship, really becoming very active at the local level and talking to people, frankly and truthfully, about what's happening to this country. I mean, we've got a chance right now to maybe make a difference and stop this inexorable decline. But it's only going to happen with people working together and talking to each other and having open conversations, not isolated lives where you're sitting at home alone on your laptop all the time. You need to get out there, support your local merchants, talk to people, and forget about these partisan divides of the past. Yes, we're always going to find points of disagreement, but surely, as people of the West, we can agree that we, the people, should be in charge of the government and not the reverse. And if we can just agree to that, we've taken huge steps to disable the Great Reset and to maybe give us hope for the future.
Well said. Jeffrey Tucker, I'm so glad that you could join us and we could have this far reaching discussion about the state of the United States. And thank you so much for your research and leadership in so many respects. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you for watching Leaders on the Frontier. We're a nonpartisan think tank. We explore ideas, policy, and practical solutions that can make a difference in the lives of Canadians. We do not accept any government funding. We work for you. Thank you for supporting Frontier. Visit fcpp.org to give. While you're there, be sure to check out our latest articles and research. Without open discussion and debate, you're not thinking, nor are you free. Comment below. We'd love for you to join the conversation.